Hey, I'm Andrew Connell. What you're about to watch is the overview lesson to one of the chapters in my MS-600 exam prep guide course. This course is available for purchase on my site, voitanos.io. I'll include a link to it in the description below the video. This overview video, which is the first lesson of the chapter that you selected, gives you an idea of what the chapter is going to cover. You can learn more by checking out the description below the video about this chapter. If you've got any questions about the chapter or the course, just drop a comment below the video and I'll be sure to get back to you. So with that, let me get out of the way. Enjoy the overview lesson from this chapter. Hello and welcome back. In this chapter, I'm going to focus on the workload called Microsoft Identity, but that's a bit misleading in my opinion. And I think you'll agree, and understanding why will help you efficiently prepare for the exam. Microsoft Identity is the marketing label that Microsoft uses for the entire identity platform from Microsoft. And it includes the following things. It supports authentication for MSA accounts, which are Microsoft personal accounts, including those that you use to log into things like Skype, Xbox, and Outlook.com. Azure Active Directory, which is also referred to as Azure AD or AAD, and these are commonly referred to as work and school accounts. And then Azure AD B2C, which is also referred to as business to consumer or business to customer. It also implements OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect to help support different multiple authentication scenarios. It also includes open source libraries with multiple variations of these different open source libraries. The most current version is the Microsoft Authentication Library, also known as MSAL. MSAL replaced the previous library, which is Azure AD Authentication Library, which we knew of as ADAL. I'll talk more about MSAL later in this chapter. The Identity Management Portal is located at https://aad.portal.azure.com. And it's the same management portal for Azure AD that you've access to within an Azure subscription, except they wanted to make it available to anyone who can manage the tenant without needing a full-blown Azure subscription. So they created this extra little interface. Microsoft Identity also includes an API, PowerShell cmdlets, and commands in the Azure CLI that enable the creation, management, and all the configuration of Azure AD applications. And finally, Microsoft Identity also includes loads of developer content such as documentation, a glossary of terms, quick starts, and plenty of tutorials used to educate developers on the platform. This workload is only going to account for 10 to 20% of the questions in the question pool that could show up when you take the exam. As the introductory chapter explained, this has changed quite a bit over time. Now, everything in Microsoft 365 is founded on identity. Whenever the context of a customer solution goes beyond a simple scenario of code running in the context of the current user, Microsoft Identity is also where apps are defined, permissions are registered, and security is enforced. This workload is unique with respect to the MS-600 exam and the M365 developer certification in the sense that I think you should have a firm grasp of all the parts of this topic. It will benefit you not just in Microsoft 365 projects, but in any Microsoft Cloud-related project that you're going to be involved in. Now that you know what Microsoft Identity is and how much of the exam it accounts for, let's look at the depth of knowledge that you need to have in these various areas. Recall Bloom's taxonomy from the overview chapter in this course? Let's use that to provide some context around what you need to know, because it helps to understand how you need to know something before you embark on studying for that topic. This helps you grasp the level of the questions that you'll see in the exam. Now, when you look at the skills checklist that Microsoft provides for the MS-600 exam, you're going to notice most of the skills include the following words. Things like describe, identify, use, create, implement, and plan. Now, these phrases fall across the entire spectrum of the taxonomy. That means for Microsoft Identity, we're going to focus on the entire pyramid of this taxonomy, all the way from the lower order thinking skills like remember and understand, all the way up to the higher order thinking skills like evaluate and create. Now let's take a minute to explore what lessons that you're going to find in this chapter so that you can know what to expect as you proceed through the Microsoft Identity chapter. In this current overview lesson, you've learned what the Microsoft Identity workload is all about. On the next slide, I'm going to wrap up this lesson with some additional learning resources, and be sure to check the notes on this lesson under the video below for a collection of all the external resources and references that I'm going to use throughout this chapter. The Microsoft Identity workload is huge, but you don't need to know everything about this topic in order to pass the exam. So in the next lesson, I'm going to call out specific things that you need to focus on, as well as things that you can ignore as they aren't relevant to the exam. In the next two lessons, I'm going to go through all the various core identity topics and authentication flows that are supported by Azure AD that you should be prepared to answer questions about on the exam. Next, we'll look at how you can create and configure Azure AD apps using the Azure AD portal. This lesson will cover how to manage who has access to the app using things like users, groups, and app roles. One component, or one key component of Microsoft Identity and apps, are the different types of permissions, as well as the consent framework. Now, I explained this in this lesson, what you need to know about these different topics. And in the last lesson, you're going to learn what you need to know when it comes to configuring custom apps and APIs that you're going to build to be secured and leverage Azure AD, at least to the extent that you're going to be tested on the M65 exam. And just like all the other chapters in this course, I'm keeping the depth of the explanation to the level that you need to know in order to pass the exam. I'm not trying to go too deep with my explanations because this is an exam prep course. It's intended to teach you, it's not intended to teach you everything about each one of these different topics. There are plenty of other resources that are available to you that you can leverage if you are familiar with a particular topic. And when I cover something in the course, you may think, okay, I got it. I'm comfortable with my knowledge on this topic. But if you think to yourself, I don't get it, or if you aren't familiar with a process or an API that I cover, then you should go read up on the official documentation or study one of the multiple resources that I'm referencing throughout this course to make sure that you are adequately familiar with the topic prior to taking the exam. Now, I'll reference specific resources throughout the course, but like I said before, be sure to check the notes for this lesson under the video below for a collection of all the external resources that I use throughout this entire chapter. But on this slide, I want to quickly run through the Microsoft Learning resources that I'm providing and explain what's in each one of these things. The first group of links are around Microsoft Learning, and they have learning paths and modules, and a learning path is a collection of modules that have been strung together. The learning path for Microsoft Identity is called Implement Microsoft Identity Associate, and it contains the modules used for self-paced study to study for the exam. And then we have 5 modules that cover various topics that I'll reference throughout this chapter. All of these modules contain hands-on labs, so if you want to practice some of the topics, like if you need to be more familiar with them prior to the exam, then that's a great place for you. These are great resources for you. These modules are as follows: getting started with Microsoft Identity, application types in Microsoft Identity, permissions and consent framework, secure custom APIs with Microsoft Identity, and then finally work with users, groups, and roles in custom apps and APIs. Now, Microsoft Identity contains a ton of documentation as well on their site. The 2 links that I want to call out here is the homepage that's titled, "What is the Microsoft Identity Platform?" and the glossary of terms. Okay, that wraps up the overview lesson. And in the next lesson, we're going to cover what topics you need to know and what topics you can avoid. So I'll see you in the next lesson.